Today we're going to try and recreate my favorite snare drum tone of all time, the Paramore Riot snare, and we're going to try and do it with no samples. Man, I'm excited about this one. When I first started kicking around the idea to do this series of reinventing snare drum tones, this was the first one that went on the list. Like, there are no more iconic snare drum tones in my mind than the Misery Business snare. When I first heard it when I was like 16, it floored me. I didn't even know you could get drums to sound like that. And not just me, but every other drummer of my generation in my scene was just like, what is that? How do we get that? Like, what is going on there? And not just for drummers, but production standards after this record came out changed like forever. You still hear references to this record being made today. Like, drum production was not the same post Misery Business. Now, this is a cut down version of what is a much longer video that can be found over on my Patreon page. There's a lot more information there. There's free samples, there's all sorts of stuff. I'm only asking for $5 a month. It goes a long way to support me and the channel. So if that sounds good, please check it out. Otherwise, enjoy. So the drum we're gonna be using today is the same one that was used on the track. It's a 14x8 Pearl Vinnie Paul signature snare drum. I got lucky and picked this sucker up a few years back before Vinnie passed away. They are rare as hen's teeth now. So if you do ever get the chance to get one, I highly recommend it, though they're probably not going to be cheap. This drum is sick. 14x8 maple shell. It looks insane, but it sounds insane in a good way. I kind of get what all the fuss is about with this drum. It's just an absolute weapon of an instrument. So we're going to put it through its paces today, see what it's capable of. Now, the thing to note is that there are multiple samples being used on this track and all over this record. Bendeth and Dan Korneff, who engineered and mixed this record, have talked a lot about the various different drums and the samples that we use. And they sound great. There's nothing wrong with samples, but I'm coming at this from an educational perspective, and I'm also trying to see how much we can suck out of our drum and like a little bit into production world before we start needing to reach for those tools. So let's get into this and see what we can do. So I managed to track down some multi-tracks of this song, which is going to make it a lot easier to get under the hood and figure out what's going on here. I've just soloed out the drums. We're going to listen to the opening snare hit a bunch of times, and we're going to try and figure out what the tuning range is going to be based on this. I'm going to grab an EQ. We're going to pull up a little spike here, and we're going to sweep around and see what pops out. Straight away, that 193 Hertz seems to be popping out to me as a pretty good fundamental. That seems to be where I'm hearing like the majority of the body of the note. So that'll be the fundamental note that we're going to be aiming for. And then this ringing frequency that you can kind of see lit up. Somewhere around like 269, 270. That seems to be the sweet spot for that ring. And it's quite prominent. You can even see just on the frequency graph. The ring is like as loud as the fundamental. Interesting. Good to know. Okay, now that we know what we're going to be tuning to, let's jump over the drum and see if we can get it there. All right, now that we know what we're aiming for, 193 fundamental. If we're lucky, we can get a resonant ring around 269. See how we go. The trick with this song is that they used a lot of samples to reinforce the sound, so it's hard to know which drum was contributing to the ring, which one was contributing the most to the fundamental, how dampened the Vinnie Paul drum in question was. We'll have to play around with it a little bit. I think we can get pretty close with one drum. I don't really want to go to samples. Heads, we've got a controlled sound X on top. Now I know Dave Bendeth has been like vocal about the fact that he likes using regular coded ambassador heads. We might try that. If we can't get the right sort of tone out of this drum, I've got an ambassador ready to go that we might chuck on. Otherwise, I quite like this head. I find it a really just good catch-all. It's controlled enough, but it can still be open and ringy if you tune it that way. And that's kind of what we're going for. It's this really punchy, hard-hitting, but bright and open sort of sound. I think this head will probably do a pretty good job. It's my go-to for a reason. Underneath that, we've just got a regular ambassador snare side head and a 20-strand wire. Nothing crazy. We're not doing 40-strand wires like a lot of people like to run on this snare. We're just going to keep it simple. So we're going to start with the bottom head, get that flipped over, get that up to a nice starting point, and then come back to the batter side. Let's get into it. All right, Rezo, we're gonna go 400 hertz to start with. As always, it's my go-to, just as a nice clean starting point for any sort of snare tuning. If we want a bit more fatness, we can go lower. We want it to thin out a little bit, we can go higher. We'll start there, we'll see what happens. So let's get it going. Let's test. 400 hertz on the nose, look at that, beautiful. All right, 400s across the board. We'll flip the drum over now, do the batter side. We'll double check the reso before we do any recordings, because oftentimes when you're tuning up the top head, the bottom head can be influenced by the tension you're adding to the drum. But that's a good starting point. Let's flip over. All right, top head's all loosened up. Just gonna do the same thing, finger tight everything, and then we'll start tuning it up. Now we're gonna be aiming for that fundamental of 193, but keeping in the back of our mind that ringing frequency of 269, I think we said. So what I might do first is actually aim for a lug pitch of 269 hertz. I find that oftentimes that resonant ring that you get from a drum is going to be relevant to the pitch of the lugs, as opposed to the fundamental of the drum. You get that fundamental punch in the face when you first hit the drum, and then that sort of decaying ring is often that 269 kind of range. So I'm going to bring it up to there first, and then I'm going to measure on the tunebot what our fundamental is. I'm not sure if that relationship is going to work. That might not be the right ratio, but we'll start there and see how we go. 269. Okay, we're in a good spot now. Let's check our fundamental. So you can hear when I hit it, we get that nice 269-ish ringing tone after the fact. However, our fundamental reads at about 174, so we're a little bit low, actually quite substantially low. Okay, let's play around with the bottom head and see if we can change the relationship between the top and the bottom head to get a little bit closer in our fatness and also ringing tone. Let's see what we can do. Okay, we've just put this to a 416, 417 kind of range. Let's flip over and see what that does. Okay, it's changed precisely nothing. I don't know if it made the drum feel any better. I mean, it sounds pretty good. It's a little like out of control. Let's just chuck a snare weight on it and see if that reins it in. It sounds really good, it just doesn't have that ring to it that I'm conscious that we probably need. I quite like that. Okay, so we know that a 416 300 ratio for this particular drum with this particular drum head works quite nicely. That gives us that 193 fundamental whack. Maybe we'll do a quick swap over to the ambassador head and just see what that does. We're around 269 on the reso now, 270 sometimes, but this is just a test. If we like it, we'll fine tune it afterwards. Let's see what this is going to reveal. Sounds pretty good. Fundamental. 181. 4 hertz higher. We'll check the bottom, see what's going on there. I'm curious to see if we go a little bit over that 416 marker, where we end up. I'm gonna try and go a little higher again. All right, we are at about 185. Now ringing frequency is about the same. We only need like 8 more hertz and we're like 100% there with the right ringing tone. So it seems like maybe the bottom head's the one to go for. Let's see what we can get out of it. Okay, we're getting into the 430s now. TuneBot's having a hard time reading it. Let's see what that does to our fundamental. This is really close, actually. It's 189 consistently as our fundamental. Maybe just a little bit more on the reso. 193. Yeah, nice. It sounds good. I really like it. I think we've got a winner here. So we're going for a 269 lug frequency on top with what I think is about a 440 something on the bottom. I'll figure out that pitch and put it in the actual final notes on the video. Cool. Let's chuck it on the kit and see what we can get out of it. Okay, I just did a really rough pass on the drums. I've spent a bit of time mixing and kind of massaging this into place. And I wanted to show you guys where we've landed here. I'm pretty happy, to be honest. Have a listen. I mean, that kind of sounds like it to my ears. I'm actually pretty stoked on that. I don't really consider myself a particularly great mix engineer, and to get it kind of like in the ballpark, yeah, I'm happy with that. So let me walk you through a little bit about what's going on here, what I've done with the drum mix. Snare top, just a 57, an instance in VMR where I'm running it through SSLG style saturation, driving it pretty hard. Trying to get it to get that like aggressive kind of Dan Korneff sort of sound. Into SSL EQ, where really I'm not doing much, like barely even. I've probably just forgot to turn that off. Slight boost at 8K, -6 at 600, and in a pretty like sharp bell. And again, narrow Q, here we are at 288, getting rid of about 4 dB of that. And a pretty substantial boost around 5.5, 6 dB at 154. So below the fundamental, trying to bring it up, and a little bit of high passing. And as well as that, using a little bit of expansion here, just to kind of separate it from some of the cymbal bleed. And then a pretty healthy dose of revival, just to get that nice like openness to it. That's about it going on there. There's no EQ on the channel, nothing else. Snare bottom. So snare bottom, doing a fair bit of gating. There was a lot of spill in this, and because we're going to be compressing the snare quite hard, I wanted it to be fairly clean. Driving the absolute heck out of it with this RC tube. The drive's all the way up, the input's all the way up. I wanted this thing to be rattly and distorted and like really aggressive. Fair boost of the high end, 7 dB around 8K. 8 dB, right around the fundamental, 187. We're going to be dropping 4 dB around 440, and we're going to be boosting 2 dB around 900, just kind of like giving a little bit of like high mid. Tiny amount of compression. This is barely tickling the snare. Yeah, you can't even see it on the meter. It is doing a little bit, but it's mostly, again, for our expansion here. That's kind of like doing a fair bit. A little bit of gain compensation. And then again, revival, shimmer. This trimmer isn't even doing anything. Let's get rid of it. Cool. Snare bus. We are getting a pretty substantial high pass up to 162 at 48 dB per octave. I did not want any low end going through there apparently. And we do have a little notch coming down -4 dB right around that ringing tone. It was obviously just getting a little bit heavy handed with like how much of the compression that we were adding. Plugin wise, first one is Satin. We are doing the little nollie trick here by pulling the dynamics back a little bit on the top end. It acts like a little bit like a kind of a natural gate. Just pulling the mids out and the presence just down just a slight amount because we've driven it pretty hard on the warm tape setting. Low end, I think that's pretty much, yeah, that's like the stock setting. So anything below 250 isn't really getting changed. Between 250 and 1.3, we're just pulling back a little bit and saturating a little. And then up on top, we are driving fairly hard, getting that nice bright sparkle out of it. And then we are getting a little bit of a gate as well. When it comes to gating, like I find that, you know, one doesn't always do the job. I like to do it in kind of stages and different ranges. Like this gate is nowhere near as aggressive. It's only got a range of 5 dB, but it is doing a good job of just kind of tucking it in. Once again, we're using the Brit 4KG, just getting that like SSL style harmonic saturation going on into an EQ, boosting the top end a little bit more, 3 dB-ish, around 7, and then minusing 3 around 329. And then again, a big boost, 8 dB around the bottom. Now, this is where we get a lot of the source here. So this is based off a complex limiter that Dave Bendeth uses a lot. And we are pushing it pretty hard here. And this is honestly like where the majority of the sound of this snare is coming from. I'm going to bypass it, play a little bit. Obviously there's a massive volume jump there, but it's just adding so much aggression and so much like largeness to the tone. It is bringing up the bleed like crazy, but it is doing the Lord's work in terms of getting this to sort of sit in that really aggressive Dave Bendeth, Dan Korneff style of snare production. A little bit of transient shaping here, just pushing the attack, a little bit of sustain on the end, really, really fast. A little bit of JST clip, not doing too much, just kind of like keeping it under control, any of those like ridiculous peaks. And the infinity EQ at the end is literally just me looking at a graph, comparing it to the original. So you can see that we're getting that same kind of peak around like that 193, around that 190 area. And then you can see we've also got that same kind of peak around 263, right? So we're getting those same kind of two peaks there just from the tuning, which I'm really happy with. Like we haven't had to do any crazy augmenting to do that. And there's no snare samples on any of this. This is sounding pretty massive so far. A quick note on our room tracks, they are doing a fair bit. I have this little knee mic, which is the SM7B. Adding a little bit of pop to everything. Mono room's doing a fair bit, fairly trashy. On that, I believe I'm using the Korneff talkback limiter. This is a great little plugin I've just like fallen in love with lately. It just makes things sound gnarly. Bypass. It sounds nasty and it's great. Now the close rooms are contributing a fair bit. I've pulled out a lot of that high end from the cymbals, a couple of weird little honking tones, 550, 300, just a bit of like boxy, awkward mid-range. It was kind of like getting in the way of the snare, making it sound a little flubby. Instance of Soothe, which is just kind of like chilling out some of that super aggressive cymbal swell you get up in there. In the VMR, we've just got, again, that Brit 4kg, and then we've got Drum Room Big preset. I didn't really try very hard with that. I think I just clicked the button and it sounded good. Again, into the talkback limiter, which, you know, you can see is like a 50-50 blend. It's a really aggressive compressor limiter. So you want to like ride the dry wet to kind of like get what you want out of it. But it does sound great without it. Just adds this like bigness to everything. And then I didn't actually record far rooms for this particular take. I'll maybe do it for the final one, but they'll be doing a very similar thing to the close rooms, just adding a little bit more length. And then the room bus itself, I don't think too much is going on there. Just, you know, cleaning up the low end, cleaning up a weird little tone around 430 when I like put everything. But the main thing that's going on here is we're also using the Korneff micro digital reverberator, which is a pretty rad little plugin. We're just using it on the large one and just like cranking both the dry and the wet. So it's basically like a 50-50 blend. And it just makes it sound bigger. So rooms with and without. Without. With. Awesome. Now, from what I've seen Dave Bendeth talk about, there were two different reverbs used on this. The XBX90, which unfortunately I'm not really able to find a plug-in version of. But more importantly, I think, is the AMS RMX. And I've tried a few different ones. There's a Slate version of it. There's the Glow Reverb, which is great. But I actually ended up, once again, using the Korneff micro digital reverberator. I just kind of like rolled around until I found a preset that I felt kind of like did the thing that I was after. I am running a gate in before it, which is basically just like stopping that crazy ring in the drum from hitting the reverb. So you're just getting that initial blast of the fundamental and the weight of the drum, and then that's what's sort of being fed into the reverb. Little bit of a like high pass here, just cleaning up everything below 130. That's not really necessary. And there's just a bit of an awkward like honk that was building up in the reverb. And then the drum room, which everything is sort of being sent to some extent. Same thing, just gating the front so that we're not getting a lot of like awkward extra ringing sounds, resonant frequencies we don't want. And then we've got this large and bright 1.2 seconds delay, purely wet. These are just completely wet sends and blended in. So I'll turn the reverbs off with the snare. And width. So that's pretty huge. So then finally, instead of one drum bus, I actually have them splitting out to two. I have a shell bus, which is for the shells, kick, snare, and toms. And I'm just compressing the snot out of it because it's like every time I went back to the original and compared, thinking I've compressed as hard as I should, it was like, no, compress it more, like squish that drum even more. So, okay, instance of FG stress. This is kind of like a take on the Eric Valentine thing. It's really heavily parallel low. It's like 3/4 up, it's going nuts, no high pass filter, just like really just pushing everything. Again, a bit more of the Brit 4KG, why not? A little bit of Transify, again, just pushing up the front of everything. A little bit of sustain on the upper bands just to kind of get it to kind of bloom a little bit more. And then finally, one more instance of the complex 760 limiter. Now this one's not doing quite as much. You can see it's only a 30% blend. It's just sort of shaping the tone. I've got the tone pulled down towards the lows. It's just sort of like squishing it in a little bit more. I'm going to play it and I'll sort of turn all these things on and off. And then cymbal bus, essentially, it's just the same stuff, just a lot of it's sort of bypassed. VMR is just doing the Brit 4KG harmonic thing again. A little bit of transient designing. I've just sort of left that, like it sounded nice on the cymbals, so why not? And again, the complex, again, we've turned it down a little bit more, so we're only doing the 25% blend. We're not pushing it anywhere near as hard. And I've turned the total harmonic distortion way down, like way down. And then that's kind of it. So we'll have a quick listen to it with the track back in there.
Just watch my wildest dreams come true. Not one of them in vain.
Fuck yeah. Now, I'm no Dave Bendeth, I'm no Dan Korneff. I don't even consider myself to be a professional mixer. I just play the drums and I love the drums and I wanted to see how close we could get without samples. And honestly, I think that was pretty close. So some big takeaways from today was the bottom head thing, like how high we ended up cranking that bottom head. And it actually did some really interesting things to the relationship of where the ringing tone and the fundamental of the snare were. And I think without that, we probably wouldn't have been able to achieve like such a close result in terms of like, you could see on that graph, our fundamental was essentially around the same spot as was the ringing tone. In the end, we ended up with that bottom snare around 450 Hertz, which is insanely tight. Usually I'm like a 400 no higher kind of guy, but it was really interesting to see how those two factors sort of brought that snare into line. The Ambassador head worked a treat. Honestly, like it's made me want to like try more snares out with Ambassadors. It felt right. Like I'm not 100% sure that that's what they used on the record, but it kind of did the right thing. So I'm going to jump over the kit now and let's film this cover. Let's do it. Now I have recorded some samples of this drum. If you want to grab those, head over to my Patreon. You're going to find those. You're going to find some samples of some Sleep Token stuff and whatever else I've released up till then. I'm trying to make that page like an insane place of drum nerdery where more videos like this can exist and we can like get into some pretty crazy deep dives. If that sounds like something that's interesting to you, I'd really appreciate it if you check it out. It helps out the channel a lot. Like, comment, subscribe, do all that good stuff. I'll see you on the next one.